Go ahead and open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. We're going to journey through the Ten Commandments this week and next week. And it would be easy to take a whole Sunday for each of the Ten Commandments, because each of them are certainly a sermon in and of themselves, but we're not going to do that. We would be out of the book of Exodus for about 2 more years. So I would like to have us through the book of Exodus here by Advent, the end of November. And so today I'm going to do something with the Ten Commandments. We're going to break them in. I'm going to do 4 of them today and 6 of them next week with Scott. And I want you guys to be prepared. I'm going to set this up right now. I'm going to give an overview on the commandments as a whole, and then once we hit these 4, I'll make a few brief comments on them, brief for me, and then we're going to take a moment of silence after each commandment. And I'm going to have you guys be thinking now, because I want you, for each of us, to ask the Spirit of God to reveal to our hearts and our minds around the commandments in our own life. As we think about worshiping God and having no other God before me. What does it mean to take the name of the Lord your God I made? So we're going to do that today. So it'll be a little different in terms of my sermon here today. But Exodus chapter 20, which Chris just read for us a few minutes ago, and starting there in verse 1, God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. And then unfolds these 10 commandments. And we all know the 10 commandments. At some level, we've heard them. We've heard them in church. We've heard them referred to in culture, because there's things that are thought about them, the 10 commandments in school and in all the culture. I'm not going to talk about any of that. We're going to focus on what's going on here with the people of God. But I think there was a movie made about the 10 commandments at one point in time. My wife, Chris says I look like Charlton Heston. The grayer I'm getting and the crazier my hair is growing, like when Charlton Heston's coming down carrying the 10 commandments. Yeah, that's what I'm going for anyway. So, here's the thing: the 10 commandments are actually 10 words. The word for the 10 commandments, these are actually in the Hebrew. They're said to be 10 words. These are the 10 words of God. It's hugely significant. Moses goes up on the mountain to meet with God. As we've been journeying through here, they come to Mount Sinai, and you have this back and forth that's going on, and now the people of God are coming. We talked about this last week. The people of God come up to the foot of the mountain, and Moses goes up, and he meets with God, and God spoke these words. This is hugely important. God spoke these words, and these are called the 10 words. We call them the 10 commandments, but they're actually called the 10 words. And they are the words of the covenant. I'll hit on that in just a moment. But these words were spoken directly by God. The reason why the 10 commandments are so important is because they're spoken directly by God, and they're called the 10 words themselves. They are the words of the covenant. This is a covenant-making ceremony that's happening, and these words are the words of the covenant. These are the words that are going to go on the tablets, which you guys have heard about. Now, the word versus commandment, and also when we think about the 10 commandments, when we think about the law of Moses, you guys have heard this terminology. When you hear the word commandments and you hear the word law, do you have a good response in your hearts when you start thinking about the law, when you start thinking about commandments? What kind of response does that create in you?
It's like a requirement.
A requirement. I think about the law, and I'm driving down the road, and then there's that sign that says something like 35, and I look at my speedometer, and it's more like 40 something 55. Going on, right? Yeah. Law, right there. And it creates this sort of like... And so, our English language doesn't always help us. Our own sin nature doesn't always help us when we think about some of these things. These words are the words of God, and they are the 10 words. The whole Psalm 119 that we just went into, which emphasized the delight that they're precious, that they're more valuable. Because the Hebrew Torah, which we get law from in our English, the idea of Torah isn't law like speed limits. It's actually parental instruction. It's actually, what do you teach your child? And they're growing up, that they might raise up to live a good life, to be responsible, to respect other people, to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Don't touch the stove when it's hot. I mean, little things to big things. It's super important for us so that we don't create this dichotomy that the law is negative, or we don't think of it strictly through this legal sense. To see them as good, as words of life, as words of a loving parent to their child, of ways to walk into. We've talked about here in this Exodus series of metaphors throughout the Bible that describe God and his relationship to his people. I drew this from J.I. Packer's Knowing God, but is there, isn't unique to Packer, but he does a really good job with this. But those metaphors of God and his relationship to his people, and that one of the first metaphors is a father to children. That God is a father, and in his people, the people of Israel, and now in the New Covenant community of the church, we are his children. And he cares for us as a father does. And this is through here, all through the Bible. But it's here in Exodus where he calls them my people, where he says that Israel is my firstborn son, in this whole confrontation with Pharaoh. And as we look at the 10 words of God, we get this metaphor that just comes through it again. It is as a father, a loving father, who disciplines his children. We get that in Hebrews chapter 12. These words are spoken as a father to his children, of words of life, how you're going to grow up. If you're a parent, you can reflect on this and maybe your own child raising. If you're not a parent, you can reflect on maybe some of the words of wisdom your parents gave you. Hopefully there were some good words in there as you grew up. But as a father of children, that's a big metaphor. That's what I want us to have that sort of in our minds here as we hear these 10 words of God. The second metaphor that we get is a king to a servant. Right? That God is a king, he's sovereign, and his people are his servants. If you look back on Exodus chapter 19, here as the people first come to Sinai, what does he say to them? I brought you to myself. You guys are going to be my treasured possession. I talked about how that's like the crown jewel. The people of Israel are his crown jewel and his crown that he wears. They're to be to him a kingdom of priests. So we get this metaphor that comes through here in Mount Sinai, and this covenant making that's happening, this father to children, this king to a servant. The other big metaphor that runs throughout the Bible, we don't see it as much present right here in this immediate, is shepherd to sheep. You know, Psalm 23, all through the Bible, Jesus in John 10, I am the good shepherd. So how does God relate to his people? As a shepherd to sheep, as he cares for his sheep, as he goes after the lost sheep. The last metaphor of how God relates to his people, that's all through the Bible, becomes super evident and formalized here in this chapter, and that is a husband to a wife. These are the 10 words of a covenant. And the covenant that's happening here at Mount Sinai, God is going to look back to on this day for the rest of the Old Testament and say, on that day at Sinai, I betrothed you. And that day at Sinai, I married you. And you were my beloved. You became my wife, and I am a husband to you. And this metaphor is present here because this whole thing that's taking place is a covenant-making ceremony. And God is going to look back to the rest of the Old Testament to Mount Sinai here and say, on this day I married you, and you became my wife. And I promised faithfulness and love and goodness to you, as a husband promises those things to his wife, to care for, provide, and protect, all that stuff. And then that picture. And Israel was to respond as a wife to a husband with fidelity and love and faithfulness. The hard words that come, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because these words are repeated later in Exodus. When we get there, I'll cover them there. But the hard words that come after the second commandment, where it says, I am a jealous God. I want us to think about framing that in the form of this marriage covenant ceremony that's happening. Even when Jesus, I'm a jealous God. There is a right and appropriate jealousness in a marriage relationship. Husbands and wives are jealous for each other in a right way. I know sin gets mixed up in there, but with God that's never the case. But those words that are even spoken here, we have this metaphor in this covenant that's happening is God is marrying his people, and he's promising to be their faithful husband. It's a beautiful thing. So this covenant that's going on here, this covenant in comparison to the Abrahamic covenant, which we go back to almost every week. I almost bring up the Abrahamic covenant. I'm the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the other really, really important thing for us to get here related to these 10 words, these 10 words of this covenant. There already is a covenant that is in existence. It's the Abrahamic covenant. It's through the Abrahamic covenant that God has called his people to himself, that he has redeemed them, and it has priority and it has precedence over this covenant that's going to happen, this marriage covenant that's happening here at Mount Sinai. And it is that Abrahamic covenant that's eternal and it's unconditional. Going back to Genesis 15, where God walks through the animals by himself. As long as I'm alive, I promise to do good to Abraham, you, and your offspring. How long is God alive? Forever. And the other thing around that covenant is that God passed through the midst of the animals by himself, alone. He bound himself and put no requirements upon Abraham and his offspring for God to fulfill his part in that covenant. And so that's why it's called unconditional. What's happening here in the Mosaic covenant is an outworking of the Abrahamic covenant. This covenant, overarching covenant of grace, it's an outworking of it. And as opposed to being eternal, it's temporal. It's temporal. It's meant to be not permanent. It's meant to have an expiration date on it. The Mosaic covenant is temporal. It's put into existence at Mount Sinai, and it expires, so to speak, AD 33. And Jesus Christ is on the cross. And what happens to the curtain in the Holy of Holies? It's shredded. It's ripped apart. Jesus came to fulfill, and he does, in perfect obedience, the words. And then, as the sacrificial Passover lamb, the Mosaic covenant has fulfilled its course. There's no more need for it. So it's temporal. But the other big thing, and this is where it gets hard for us sometimes to understand, because by our own nature, as opposed to the Abrahamic covenant, which is unconditional, this is a conditional covenant. The people promise to obey. And there are very, very specific things that they promise, a lot of them. There's going to be like 612 specific commandments in the Mosaic covenant. The people promise to obey, and obedience brings blessing in very specific ways. And they also take upon themselves, within the context of this covenant, curses if they disobey. And you can look at Deuteronomy 28, 29, and 30, when there's blessings and cursings that are going on. If I obey, God's going to bless me in A, B, and C way. If I disobey, God is going to curse me in A, B, and C way. Very specific things that are happening within the context. And it's setting forth the nature of this marriage relationship, if you would, between God and his people. And we get in trouble when we try to read some of those specific obedience brings specific blessings, and specific disobedience brings specific cursings, and translate them directly into our life in the here and now. They're done away with. They've been fulfilled. So Jesus went to the cross for. It was a temporal covenant. Galatians 4 says that very specifically, that this covenant was put in place until the fullness of time came, when there would be one who was born of a woman who would come to fulfill it. All right, so lastly, before we get into these specific 4 covenants, you guys have all seen the picture, whether it's in Moses, and Charlton Heston in the 10 Commandments carrying down the 2 tablets, or you've seen pictures of 2 tablets. How are the words on the 2 tablets usually portrayed pictorially? How are the commandments portrayed? Like half and half, right? Or you might have 5 on one and 5 on the other, or 4 on one and 6 on the other, depending how they're divided up. It's probably not how it actually happened. Over the last 100 years, we've dug up a lot of archaeological sort of things, and what's come out in the last 100 years or so is that covenant making in the near Middle East was very, very common, and there was covenants that were done between kings and people, kings and their servants, and there was always, guess what, 2 copies of the covenants that were made. One for the king, one for the people. Full copy, full copy. So more than likely, these 2 tablets each had the full 10 words on them, the full 10 commandments. Because one was for Yahweh God as a reminder to him, and one was for the people of God as a reminder to them. 1 copy for God, 1 copy for the people. Where did those copies go? In the Ark of the Covenant. Where did the Ark of the Covenant go? In the Holy of Holies, the place where God's presence was here on earth, the footstool of God. And so the 2 tablets were copies of the covenant, these 10 words, as a reminder to God and as a reminder of people of what they were taking on. So, having said that, there is sort of the Christian church through these centuries has divided the 10 commandments, divided these 10 words into 2 sections. Duty to God, duty to people. And Jesus' 2 great commandments have sort of like lined up with these 2. And so on the duty to God side, the first 4 commandments, Jesus, when he's asked what are the 2 great commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And these first 4 commandments are related to God. And the last 6 commandments are sort of related to a relationship with other human beings. And so that's why you have this duty to God and duty to people that's going on. So we'll get there. Today we're going to cover the first 4, which are about our duty to God. Before we get there, do we have the gospel order up there? We do. Good. Go back to Exodus 20, verse 1 with me. I'm just going to keep doing this every week as well. What's the gospel order? Accepted, obedience, blessing. It was true for the people of God then. It's true for us now as the people of God. Before God gives them the 10 commandments, so to speak, like here's the things you are to do, what does he say first to them? Verse 2, I am Yahweh your God who did what? Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The very first words of the 10 words, if you were, the very first words that God speaks and that are engraved by the hand of God on these tablets of stone is a reminder to the people that he's redeemed them. That they were slaves. They had no way out of the condition they were in. And he redeemed them. Isn't that a beautiful thing? So even before we go into the commandments, we're reminded again that the gospel is about what God has done for us. First and foremost, our response to God's action, is walking in these commandments, walking in these laws. We don't walk in these laws, in these commandments, these words, in order to earn God's acceptance. And I like that that puts it here. In our liturgy that we use a modern version of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. I like very much that in the Ten Commandments we do here, we start with these words, and the Lord God, because it puts it up front. In the original 1662, it doesn't start there. It just starts with, you shall have no other gods before me. And I like that. Our brothers and sisters down in Sydney brought in that opening statement because it reminds us every time grace comes first. So there's the gospel order. Now, these first four commandments, which cover our duty to God. I am pulling up from the old prayer book catechism here, which covers these first four. And the catechism says, what does thou chiefly learn by these commandments? I learned two things, my duty towards God and my duty towards my neighbor. The first four, the second six. So for this morning, what is my duty towards God from the catechism? And this is just a summation of these four commandments, these four words. My duty towards God is to believe in him, to fear him, and to love him with all my heart, and with all my mind, and with all my soul, and all my strength. To worship him, to give him thanks, to put my whole trust in him, to call upon him, to honor his holy name and his word, and to serve him truly all the days of my life. It's a nice summation of those first four commandments. First duty is to believe in him, because belief is faith. Faith is the means by which we receive the promises of God, and through which we're enabled to love God and fear him appropriately and rightly. So, we're going to spend a few minutes on these four. I pulled these. I read Luther, Calvin, Westminster, Heidelberg, Anglican Book of Common Prayer catechisms over the last several days. There's so much on the Ten Commandments. I read Packer's book, Growing in Christ, which covers them. And I was like, how am I going to cover all these? All right, I'm just going to simplify this. So I went to New City Catechism, which Tim Keller's and the Gospel Coalition put out some years ago. And it is a condensed version of the catechisms. So let's start here. The first commandment, the first word, if you would. What does God require in the first commandment? And the answer is that we know and trust God as the only true and living God. And the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall have no other gods before me. So what does God require here that we know and trust as the only true and living God? This is dealing with idolatry. Israel is coming out of Egypt, where there were many gods, multiple forms of gods. Isis, Ra, Cyrus, all the gods of Egypt. They're going into the land of Canaan, where there's a whole bunch of gods there too. But they're all false gods. None of them are the true God. So what does God require in this first commandment? That we know and trust him as the only one and true living God. Before all else, God is first in their hearts. This really is an issue of your heart before God. Is my heart fully devoted to God and God alone before anything else? Of course, the answer to that is no. But This is part of our life's work, to continuously bring our heart before God. As Jesus says, that we might love him with our heart, mind, soul, and strength. The heart is the center of our being. And when it comes to this, as we look around, we go, is God at the center of your heart? And only you can answer that question. What does that look like? We don't worship idols in the way that they did back then. I don't think any of you are at home carving things out of wood and overlaying them with gold or something like that and bowing down to them. I don't think. Hopefully not. If you are, please come talk to me. But we have idols. Again, John Calvin's, one of his most famous quotes from the Institute is that the human heart is an idol-making factory. We will find something to worship because we were created to worship. The gods of our culture, the gods of individualism and consumerism and materialism and hedonism, they all pull us in different directions. And we find ourselves, so idols, again, that definition is, an idol is whatever you look to for worth, for value, to give you meaning, where you find satisfaction other than God in. And to put our trust in something else, in money, in myself. We live in a culture of individualism. We live in a culture where I can stand up and say, I'm going to speak my truth to you. And it may be completely different than your truth. But you don't have any right to say it because I, as the individual, can speak what's true for me. What does God require in the first commandment? That we know and trust God as the only true and living God. What we're going to do is we're going to take a moment of silence. I want you to contemplate on this. I want you to ask God to reveal to you, what are the ways in which I'm not living out this commandment? What are the ways in which I am trusting in false gods and idols in his place? So we'll take a moment of silence here. Talk to the Lord and let him speak to you. The first commandment is related to our heart before God. It's God at the center of our hearts. The second commandment has to do with how we think about God. What does the second commandment say? You should not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness that is in heaven above or the earth below or the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So what does God require in the second commandment? In the New City Catechism, the answer is that we avoid all idolatry and do not worship God improperly. Again, as I went just a minute ago about idols in particular, but the heart of this commandment is really getting into what we think about God. If we think differently about God than how he's revealed himself in his word then we're making a God of our own imagination, of our own thinking. That's what idols are. Idols are a visible representation of what we think God is like. What we think God is like. And the reality is this, as I said last week at the beginning of my sermon, how do we comprehend the incomprehensible? We don't. God is spirit. He is so wholly other than. He is holy, and he's so wholly other than to you and I. He's so different. He is impossible to put into physical representation what the very essence of God is like. It all falls short in some way or another. How can we express the inexpressible in a physical representation? We can't. And that's what idols do. And again, I don't think any of us are at home making physical images of God. But in our minds, what do we think about God? All of us, I'm going to make this statement. I think all of us struggle with some part or other of how God has revealed himself in his word. I bet you when Chris read a few minutes ago that I am a jealous God and I visit iniquities down to the third or fourth generation of those who hate me. I bet you some of you, if maybe not every one of us in this room, there's some unsettling thought about that. How do I reconcile that? What does that say about God? Do I believe that? I'm not going to answer that question for you today. We'll get to that later. Are my thoughts about God, do they line up with how God has revealed himself, of who he is, in his word, the Bible? And there's parts of that I think you of us struggle with. And it might be different for some. I think there's some common things. I think you guys have probably been in conversations before with people who go, I have a hard time believing in a God who would be like this, or a God who would do that. And you may have said those words at some point in time as well. God says, you can only think about me in the way that I've revealed myself to be in the fullness of whom I am. And words can only go so far in trying to express the inexpressible, but images do not. And what we wind up doing is we wind up worshiping the image that we create. And it's all that comes from our mind. It's all that comes from our own thinking about God. And it might be as little as going, I don't understand that part about God, so I'm just going to sort of like ignore that or push that away, try not to understand that, or pretend that's not really what God is like. To flat out coming to a place where like going, I can't believe in a God who would da, 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 da. How we think about God is super important. So let's take a minute in silence again. I want you to ask God, what are those ways in which my thoughts about you don't line up with who you are and how you've revealed yourself to be through your word? first commandment is about our heart before God, and the second commandment is really what we think about God. The third commandment is how we speak about God, how we talk about him. In the old King James, what does it say? Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. What does God require in the third commandment? In the New City Catechism, the answer is that we treat God's name with fear and reverence, honoring also his word and works. And growing up, this third commandment, growing up in the church is like, don't swear, you're breaking the third commandment. You guys are, yep. And I think obviously it covers, you guys know, look, how do people swear using God's name? I'm not going to ask you to say it out loud. You know. Do people swear using God's name? They say things like gosh darn in place of some other thing. They use Jesus' name with some swear words. That's a piece of it, for sure. But that's really not the heart of this. Again, if how we think about God, does it line up with who he truly is? How do we speak about God? Does it line up with who he is? What do we say? Is it in line with his character? How do we tell others about God? Is it in fullness of who he is? And there's a very particular, for sure, in this about oath-taking, right? And you guys you may have done this yourself at some point in time in your life. Certainly seen it in movies and read in books. Something happens, and someone says, I swear by God, if by a year from now, I will do this, or I'll take revenge, or things like that. It's very much related to what's going on here. I'm just going to read James 4. You don't have to turn there. We don't have time. But I'm going to read James 4 because this is kind of the heart of this here. Where James says, come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time, then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. And this is certainly at the heart of the third commandment, which someone would dare to boast and say, invoke the name of Yahweh, the covenantal name of Yahweh, and say, I will do this, and God will see it done. How dare we? Big picture. How do you speak about God? Is it in line with the character, his own character? Does it match up with who he is and how he's revealed himself to be? Do I think rightly about God? Second commandment. Do I speak rightly about God? Let's just take a moment again of silence. The fourth commandment has to do with time, what we do in action related to God. So what does God require in the fourth commandment? New City Catechism says that on the Sabbath day we spend time in public and private worship of God, rest from routine employment, serve the Lord and others. And I love this last part. I love this last part that they add in here. So we anticipate the eternal Sabbath. So it's a looking forward as well. I grew up in the church. Here's what I remember about growing up in the late 70s and Sabbath routine. Saturday night was our weekly bath as a kid. And so I just remember Saturday night would come, and at some point we'd all have to get our baths. And I remember my sisters and my mom putting their hair up in the little curlers, the little pink curlers things, and they would have to sleep in those, overnight, so their hair would be curly for Sunday morning church. And then we'd get up Sunday morning, we had our Sunday church clothes that we would wear, and we'd get ready for church. And I remember my mom would be putting a roast on the stove. Then we'd go to church, and that roast would be simmering. So then we'd come home from church, and we'd have our Sunday lunch, Sunday dinner, pot roast with potatoes and gravy and carrots and stuff. And then we'd get out of our Sunday dress clothes, and we'd lay them on our bed. We had to lay them on our bed flat. So, and then we had the afternoon, and we could play football season. I'd watch football. And then about 5 o'clock, we'd have to start to get ready for Sunday evening church, because church is usually at 6 o'clock. And so it would be some kind of light dinner, and then we'd put our Sunday dress clothes back on, and we go to church, and we come home after that. Sabbath memories. And we've lost some of that in our culture. Maybe I shouldn't say some of that. I'd say we've lost all of that in our culture. Sabbath is important. Sabbath is the thing that God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And Jesus said, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. And Sabbath wasn't, the man wasn't made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath for man. There's something really, really, really important about Sabbath. There's something really, really important about what we're doing here today. That you're taking time, you're disrupting the normal routine of your life, because all time, what did it say in James? We're a mist. You're here today and then you're vanished, gone. But there's an eternal rest. There's an eternal Sabbath that's coming. And this participation in this is participation of gathering on the Lord's Day to meet with the Lord and all of that. This is super important in your life. Super important in my life. How do I spend my time? Do I recognize that God is God over time in my life? Let's take a moment of silence here. And time is marching on here this morning. So let me finish with two things here quickly. The first comes from the Prayer Book Catechism again, and it follows the duties, and this is the gospel. The catechist here says, "My good child, know this, that thou art not able to do these things of thyself, nor to walk in the commandments of God, and to serve him without his special grace, which thou must learn at all times to call for by diligent prayer." We can walk out the commandments of God apart from his grace. And so we continually need to ask him for his grace. And we do that. This is why we have this term called means of grace. The means of grace are his word. The means of grace are the sacrament. The means of grace is prayer. How does God give us grace and enable us to walk forth in newness of life?
He promises to meet with us in His Word. He promised to meet with us at the table. He promised to meet with us when we meet with Him in prayer. And He gives grace to us through His Spirit who indwells us to walk forth and carry out His Word. And then lastly is the overall mindset. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. God at the center of your being. The first commandment really covers all of it, right? At some level. One of my favorite verses from the Bible comes from the Psalm of David, Psalm 27. And so, let this be thou my vision. Let this be our vision as we walk into these things here. David said in Psalm 27:4, one thing I have asked of Yahweh, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of Yahweh all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of Yahweh and to inquire in His temple. And His temple is where His presence is. One thing I've asked, that I'm going to seek God, that I might dwell with Him. Not just today, not just tomorrow, but all the days of my life. And he says in that other very famous psalm, Psalm 23, in the last verse there, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever and ever, world without end.